Christian Anarchism frequently asked questions number 5. Didn't Jesus tell his followers to buy a sword? So if Jesus told his disciples to buy a sword, the logic goes, that must mean that Jesus promoted, supported lethal self-defense and, by some stretch of the imagination, maybe even preemptive wars. So if you limit your reading to only this verse and the one previous, it's not hard to see how Jesus could be seen as supporting the use of violence among his followers. So this is Luke 22:35 through 36 in the ESV. And he said to them, "When I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything?" They said, "Nothing." He said to them, "But now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack, and let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one." In this very limited reading, Jesus seems to be saying that at an earlier point, his disciples went out into a dangerous world with very little provisions, but God took care of them. However, as Jesus was about to be arrested and crucified and the church age was to begin, a time had now come when they would have to fend for themselves and should even travel armed as they go out preaching the gospel. But when you look at the wider context of this passage, there are good reasons to think that Jesus was not encouraging his disciples to carry a sword for self-defense. In fact, there are at least 4. 1, when Peter understood Jesus' words literally, he replied, "Lord, here are 2 swords." And Jesus responded, "It is enough." This response has been understood one of 2 ways by most translators, or not translators, exegetes, interpreters of the Bible. Either Jesus was literally saying that 2 swords were sufficient for a certain task, or he was expressing frustration that Peter had bungled so much in his understanding. In other words, all right, that's enough. If we take the first option, could Jesus really have meant that 2 swords were enough for at least 12 men to defend themselves? On the face of it, it seems comical. But there's a different purpose that 2 swords would have been enough for, and that takes us to point 2. Those who are so eager to defend violence for Christians often shoot past the very next verse after this treasured proof text. In it, Jesus actually gives the exact reason why he wanted his disciples to have swords in this moment. Quote, "For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me, and he was numbered with the transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment." In other words, Jesus wanted his disciples to have swords so that a prophecy would be fulfilled, that he would be seen as a transgressor, a violent rebel, thus justifying in the minds of those arresting him their perception of him as a threat. Which, we see that all the time. Cops shoot somebody and then they find a, gun under the car, under the seat in the car, and they're like, "Oh, look at that, he was armed." So that's the same kind of principle here. So his followers carrying swords like common criminals, in the minds of the soldiers, would be seen as vindicating the perception that he was a rebel, that he was a threat. Jesus was not saying that his followers should buy a deadly weapon and be prepared to use it, but that this is what sinners do. Thus, the sword served a very specific purpose, and it wasn't to hurt or kill their enemies. In fact, Jesus went on to chastise one of his followers for using a sword for a violent purpose that very night. So that takes us to 3. On that night, when soldiers came to arrest Jesus, we read that his followers called out, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" Just as one of them, Peter, according to the Gospel of John, struck a slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. In Luke, Jesus responds, "Stop, no more of this," and heals the slave. Matthew gives a slightly different account. Quote, "Then Jesus said to him, 'Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then will the scriptures be fulfilled, which say that it must happen this way?'" And that's Matthew 26:52 through 54. Those hoping to make this passage somehow support violence highlight only that last part, arguing that the real reason that Jesus objected to what Peter did wasn't because he was against violence, but because it didn't serve his purposes in that moment. But that wasn't Jesus' initial objection. Instead, he highlighted the futility of violence and sought to disarm Peter with his words. In addition, Jesus argues that if God wanted something done badly enough, he could intervene to make it happen. In other words, Jesus was chastising Peter for his lack of faith in God and taking the initiative in a way that Jesus didn't approve of. The fourth contextual reason to reject the pro-violence reading of Luke 22:36 is a little more complicated, and it has to do with the chiastic structure of the passage, forecasting the taking up of the sword as a kind of a practical denial of Jesus. That's a little more complicated, but you can find a detailed version of that argument from David Burnett in his handout, The Sword and the Servant, Reframing the Function of the Two Swords of Luke 22:35-38 in Narrative Context. And essentially, that is why this passage does not push up against the nonviolent reading of Christian anarchism.